As Captain Tenador Tenak arrives on the high vantage point of Lodge Trail Ridge, below the battlefield is covered in Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Fetterman's command is nowhere in sight. Sending the orderly Archibald Semple and several civilians as escort, Tenak reported that he could not see Fetterman and urgently requested a howitzer. Private Murphy wrote, "I never saw so many Indians before or since." 2,000 warriors were estimated to be roaming the battlefield. As Tenak's command came fully into view, the warriors withdrew a mile and urged the new soldiers to come down and fight. When Tenak spotted the bodies of the troopers of Company C, 2nd Cavalry, he ordered his command to march forward. As Tenak approached the group of rocks where the cavalrymen made their last stand, the soldiers would find the horribly mutilated bodies of their comrades. Join us as we begin our 6th episode of Red Cloud's War, the aftermath of Fetterman.
Well, every road I see leads away from me.
You're listening to the Tales of the Trails podcast, produced by Duke Frazier Productions in association with the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. I'm your host, Duke Frazier.
Friend, come see what's round the bend. So is it any wonder that I roam?
Listeners may find the content of parts of this episode to be disturbing. Discretion is advised. Tenak's command reached the rocks of the cavalry last stand to find the bodies in a small area that measured 35 square feet. Dapple Dave, one of the 2nd Cavalry horses, was found alive and in agony. Tenak ordered the animal put down. The fallen soldiers had been mutilated beyond comprehension. Many had had their skulls chopped open and their brains removed. Private Frank Fessenden stated that some soldiers had powder placed in their ears and ignited. Others had been burned with bundles of grass. Scalping of the troops had included removing of facial hair. John Guthrie gave one of the most gruesome descriptions of the battlefield. "We walked upon their internals and did not know it in the high grass. Picked them up, that is their internals, did not know what soldier they belonged to. So you see the cavalrymen got the infantrymen's guts, and the infantrymen got the cavalrymen's guts." Carrington's report was more highly detailed, stating, "Eyes torn out and laid on the rocks, noses cut off, ears cut off, teeth chopped out, joints of fingers cut off, brains taken out and placed on rocks, with members of the body, entrails taken out and exposed, hands cut off, feet cut off, arms taken off from the socket, private parts severed and indecently placed on the person, eyes, ears, mouth, and arms penetrated with spearheads, sticks, and arrows, ribs slashed to separation with knives, skulls severed in every form from chin to crown, muscles of calves, thighs, stomach, breast, back, arms, and cheek taken out, punctures upon sensitive parts of the body, even to the soles of the feet and palms of the hands. All this does not approximate the whole truth." Found among the group were Fetterman and Brown. Fetterman's skull was crushed and his throat and neck cut to the spine. Brown's mutilation had been one of the most horrible. Powder burns on his temple indicated that he had taken his own life. His ears had been removed. Deep gashes ran along the inside of his thighs. Brown's privates had been removed and placed in his mouth, and a spear had been shoved up his anus and protruded through his entrails, which had been exposed. The bodies were loaded up into the wagons, and Tenak ordered the return to the fort. The temperature was dropping fast, and daylight was nearly gone. As the wagons proceeded down Lodge Trail Ridge on the return, one of the wagons tipped over, and the soldiers were forced to load the bodies of their comrades once again. As Tenak approached the fort, Carrington ordered the soldiers inside to take up defensive positions. Positions were fortified within the walls of the post. Tenak oversaw the digging of entrenchments around the blockhouse in the northwest corner. Teamsters used wagons to create a breastwork around the powder magazine. Every building was lit. A blizzard was beginning, and soon the west wall was overshadowed by a snowdrift. Soldiers immediately cut a trench, but it was soon filled again. The inhabitants of Fort Phil Kearny lived in sheer terror. Carrington would write a letter to his superior, General Cook, detailing the events of the day and requesting immediate reinforcements and arms. A copy of the letter was drafted to be sent to General Grant. Carrington asked for volunteers to carry the letters to Horseshoe Station, the nearest telegraph. John Portuguese Phillips, who had been at Fort Phil Kearny since September, volunteered to make the ride. His friend, Daniel Dixon, also stepped forward. Phillips would choose Carrington's horse, named Dandy, for the ride. Carrington gave Phillips a Spencer carbine with 100 rounds of ammunition. Phillips and Dixon exited the fort at a gate behind Carrington's quarters and disappeared into the snowstorm. They would ride first to Fort Reno, arriving before daylight on December 23rd. The men had encountered a mail party led by Robert Bailey and joined them. On December 25th, the group arrived at Horseshoe Station around 10 a.m. The telegrapher, John Friend, sent the wire to Omaha and Washington. Friend could not guarantee the long message had gotten through, and Phillips decided to continue on to Fort Laramie. Bailey left Horseshoe Station to finish his route to Fort Casper. Dixon chose not to go on. He had completed the task as was asked. Phillips would make the final trek alone. Around 11 p.m. of Christmas night, Phillips arrived at Fort Laramie. Private Herman Haas was on guard duty that night and stated that Phillips was so weak he could barely talk as he delivered the message to Colonel Palmer in Old Bedlam, the post headquarters. Palmer and the other officers were attending a full-dress ball in the building. Legend states that Phillips' horse died on the parade ground in front of Old Bedlam. However, Private Haas stated that the animal was taken to the post stable where it died the following day. Post interpreters Charles Grew and Jules Ecafee had heard about the fight on the 23rd from natives that lived near the fort. They relayed this to Colonel Palmer, who had received word shortly afterward as the news came across the telegraph. Phillips was the first from Fort Phil Kearny to confirm the event. Colonel Palmer wired General Cook, stating that he could send 4 companies of infantry in support of Fort Phil Kearny. However, on the 27th of December, a blizzard made it impossible to send the column. While Phillips and Dixon made their ride to Horseshoe Station, Colonel Carrington organized a party to retrieve the rest of the dead after dark on the night of the 22nd. As they arrived at the battlefield, they found a body nearly 1 mile from where the cavalry had fallen. Wheatley and Fisher, the civilians that had accompanied Fetterman, were discovered in a pile of rocks surrounded by hundreds of spent cartridges. Several warriors later stated that these men fought bravely to the bitter end, only being overcome when they had run out of ammunition. Lieutenant Grumman was found with his skull crushed, his legs burned, and several fingers removed. The other soldiers had fared the same fate as those recovered earlier, with 2 exceptions. Private Frank P. Sullivan, the company clerk in Company C, and Adolph Metzger, the company bugler. Both had been wrapped in buffalo bags, a sign of respect of bravery. The party returned to the post at midnight, the bodies placed inside the hospital in tents. Identification of the men commenced, and the surgeon prepared the bodies for burial. Coffins large enough to hold 4 bodies per box were constructed. The soldiers began the process of digging a single mass grave. 4 feet of snow covered the ground, and the temperature hovered at 22 below zero. Soldiers swapped out of the detail at 30-minute intervals. On the 24th of December, the fallen soldiers were buried in a grave measuring 55 feet long. The coffins were stacked 2 deep. The burial was quick and without ceremony. On the 26th of December, General Crook wrote Special Order 126, which relieved Carrington of command of Fort Phil Kearny and transferred him to take command of Fort Casper. The order had also directed Colonel Palmer of Fort Laramie to send 2 companies of 2nd Cavalry and 4 companies of the 18th Infantry to Lieutenant Colonel Wessels at Fort Reno. Wessels would proceed with the reinforcements and take command at Fort Phil Kearny. As the inhabitants of Fort Phil Kearny suffered from fear and the cold of winter, the natives had returned to their camp on the Tongue River to celebrate their victory over Fetterman. Afterward, the different bands dispersed, spreading out over the Powder River country and the Bighorn Mountains to survive the rest of the winter. As 1866 turned into 1867, changes in command structure began to take place. Wessels would take over command of Fort Phil Kearny. Carrington would proceed to take command of Fort Casper. General Cook, commander of the Department of the Platte, was relieved of command by General Grant and replaced by Colonel C.C. Agur. Several investigations took place, and most, if not all, came to the same conclusion. Carrington was unfit for command in areas of hostilities, and often they cited his lack of combat experience during the Civil War. As the winter began to progress into spring, the military began planning a retaliatory action against Red Cloud. General William Tecumseh Sherman would state to General Grant that, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. Nothing less will reach the root of this case." Initially, a force of 2,000 men under the command of Colonel John Gibbon were to proceed to the Bozeman Trail to begin offensive operations. Despite all of the planning, a large-scale campaign would not materialize. As the military attempted to end Red Cloud's war by force, others in Washington sought to end it by peace. On February 18, 1867, President Johnson created the Joint Indian Commission to investigate the Fetterman disaster and prevent further conflict. A court of inquiry was organized in March of 1867. Colonel John Gibbon, Lieutenant Colonel Luther P. Bradley, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Chambers, and Major James Van Vost made up the court. They began the official proceedings on May 9th. William Bisbee was the first to testify. He stated that during his time at Fort Phil Kearny, the men had been assigned to menial duties and had not received proper drill. The only target practice that had occurred was with the veterans at random. He also stated there was a lack of discipline, with officers frequently leaving the post without orders. He believed the officers had little confidence in the commander, stating Carrington's actions during battle were the root cause. Carrington had broken up an attack on a Cheyenne village, and on December 6th it was felt that Carrington had allowed the warriors to escape to the north. The testimony of Captain Frederick Pfister and Captain Henry Hammond supported Bisbee in regard to lack of drill and lack of confidence in the commander. Colonel Carrington gave his testimony to the court on the 22nd of May. He stated that the troops had been occupied in the construction of Fort Phil Kearny until late October, and then on the 4th of October he had taken over command of the post from Captain Tenike, who had failed in his opinion to discharge the duties of his post. While Carrington had ordered some drilling of the soldiers, he stated that he lacked the officers to undertake it regularly. Carrington stated that he felt his officers were competent and subordinate. However, Captain Brown proved otherwise. On multiple occasions, Brown had violated his orders. He had joined the forces on December 6th and December 21st without orders to do so, the last costing him his life. Drummond had also disobeyed orders on the 6th, nearly ending with his death. Carrington felt that Fetterman did not understand the wiles of the Indians, neither did he know the broken country. Fetterman and Brown had told Carrington in his residence on the night of December 20th that they believed that with 80 men they could whip all the Indians about us. Carrington ended his testimony stating that Fetterman, Brown, and Grumman had lost their lives by overt disobedience of orders. Archibald Semple, Carrington's orderly, testified that he'd heard the commander give Fetterman and Grumman orders to go to the wood train and not to go over Lodge Trail Ridge. Lieutenant Wands would also testify to the lack of training, but he also testified that Tenike consumed an excessive amount of spirits to the point it affected his professionalism. He stated that while there was a lack of confidence in Carrington, Wands felt that Carrington was a better commander of the post than Tenike. Wands finished his testimony by reiterating that Carrington had given Fetterman and Grumman orders not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge. Upon reviewing the documents of the Court of Inquiry, General Grant recommended that formal charges be brought against Carrington and a formal court-martial trial instigated. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt received the recommendation from Grant. Holt recommended that there be no trial, as there was no evidence of Carrington being at fault. While Carrington had been neglectful in training and maintaining discipline, it was Fetterman who had disobeyed orders. The commission would proceed west, meeting with chiefs that had signed the 1866 treaty. As April of 1867 approached, neither peace efforts nor military campaign had made any progress toward the ending of Red Cloud's war. As frustrations continued to grow, word spread that John Bozeman had been killed. While historians speculate that Bozeman may have either been murdered by his business partner or by a local rancher, the word at the time was that he had been murdered by natives. This further sparked the want of retaliation against Red Cloud. Efforts in peace and war would continue to negate themselves through the summer of 1867. As the military continued to be flustered in the West, it was making progress in one regard. At the Springfield Armory, the conversion of the outdated muzzleloading muskets to breech-loading rifles that used fixed metallic cartridge ammunition had been progressing since late 1866. These new arms and ammunition would be sent west in the later part of the summer of 1867, just as Red Cloud begins to look for another great victory to drive the whites out of the Powder River country for good. Next time on Tales of the Trails. Established on the Bighorn River, Fort C.F. Smith is the northernmost military establishment on the Bozeman Trail. Despite small skirmishes, the brutal winter of 1866 proved more threatening than the warriors. This will change in the summer, when the first major battle of 1867 unfolds at Fort C.F. Smith's doorstep.
All the places I have been.
Tales of the Trails is produced by Duke Frazier Productions. Music performed by Garrett Woods from the 11 Bang Bang YouTube channel. Sources for this episode may be found in the description field below. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. Click the bell to receive notification of new episodes. Until next time, keep your powder dry.
Calls me as it goes.